Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the workshop on macroeconomic models for small and open economies, organized by the Economic Research Department of the Central Bank of Argentina. During these 2 days, we will have the participation of colleagues from other central banks of Latin America, both local and international scholars, and representatives of international organizations. The aim of this workshop is to openly debate about alternative forms of modeling the macroeconomic behavior of countries which might be considered as small peripheral economies open to trade and capital flows that work under alternative monetary and exchange rate regimes and face several kinds of structural and institutional restraints. Under the strong conviction that there is no such thing as a unique, universally valid macroeconomic model, we start from the premise that the discussion must celebrate both theoretical and methodological breadth. This seems to be particularly relevant in the present context. COVID-19 pandemic forced the implementation of pragmatic and blunt macroeconomic policies and posed new theoretical challenges. But it has also obliged us to implement the whole available toolkit to comprehend the different shocks that are currently affecting our economies, their transmission channels, and the outcomes of different responses. Behind this vision that relativizes the existence of a general analytical framework, there is also the idea that formal representations should be able to account for the institutional specificities of each country. In this sense, it is enough to do a little introspection and recall the modeling strategies developed at the BCRA in the first half of the past decade. These are DSGE models that incorporate the role of capital flow management policies as a way to contribute to macroeconomic stability, reduce exchange rate volatility, and allow the monetary authority to gain further policy space. An instrument that is currently recognized as part of the toolkit used in macro monetary modeling of central banks and international organizations such as the IMF or recent works by the BIS. It is around this sort of agnosticism that we have organized the workshop and gathered our speakers. Let me anticipate that between today and tomorrow, we will be exposed to contributions belonging to the most diverse theoretical traditions, from DSGE-type models with nominal rigidities to the so-called consistent stock flow models and models of the supermultiplier type, which combine the Keynesian multiplier with the investment accelerator. We will also delve into the working of a balance of payments constrained growth model inspired by the Kaldorian tradition, and finally, a work that formalizes the behavior of a dual economy with a structural heterogeneity. I no longer entertain you and finish here by thanking the speakers and discussants, not only for participating in the workshop, but also for collaborating in a special issue of our academic journal, Ensayos Económicos, on macroeconomic model for small and open economies, which will be published by the BCRA in the second half of this year. So today we have two presenters. I kindly ask them to respect our time constraint, which will be between 30 and 35 minutes for each presentation. Then we will have 10 minutes for the discussants, and then we leave some minutes for questions from the audience. For those who want to participate, please use the icon to raise your hand, and we will give you the word. So our first speaker is Professor Arslan Razmi. He's Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, where he teaches graduate and undergraduate courses in open economy macroeconomics, mathematical economics, and international trade. His research lies at the intersection of open economy macroeconomics, international trade, and development. Other interests include political economy and the history of economic thought. And his work has been published in several peer-reviewed academic journals, international academic journals. The paper is entitled Relative Quantities and Prices in Small Open Economies. And then the discussant is Emiliano Liebman, researcher at CONICET and professor at the University of Buenos Aires. So Professor Razmi, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks, Professor Feldman. And I also want to thank Professor Dvoskin and Ms. Suarez for organizing and for inviting me. And I want to thank in advance Emiliano Libman for being the discussant. I haven't heard his comments yet, but regardless, thank you for agreeing to be the discussant. Let me share the screen so that I can get started. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the determination of relative quantities and prices in a small and open developing economy. And so the focus is on small and open and developing. And the fact that I'm going to talk about those features of an economy, as I'm going to explain, makes a difference. Okay, so everyone can see the screen and everyone can hear me clearly. Okay, great. Yeah. So I'm gonna start with an overview of why being small and open and developing generates special features that are interesting. Then I'm going to talk about the pricing of tradables, what I believe to be the right approach to pricing tradables in a developing economy using a very standard monopolistic competition model. After that, I'm going to develop a more general equilibrium macro framework in which I'm going to try to address a couple of issues that are important for developing and emerging economies. Then, so for example, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Dutch disease issue. And then I'm going to end with conclusions, qualifications, shortcomings, extensions, etc. Okay, so that's the plan. So there is a large structuralist literature going back to the 1950s and 60s, a lot of it originating from Latin America, a lot of it originating from universities in North America. And some of the classic examples are Findlay, 1980, Krugman, 1981, Taylor, 1983, Blecker, 1996. And this literature focuses on the structural features that make developing economies different than what used to be called the North or the advanced industrialized mature economies. I'm going to depart from this literature. I'm going to focus on an individual economy, not differences between the North and South. And I'm going to focus on what makes a developing economy, what are the internal features of a developing economy that make it interesting to explore. So some of the features that I'm going to focus on, which I think make a developing economy different, are as follows. Number one, the imperfect substitutes framework, which is used a lot in both in typical open economy Keynesian and no Keynesian models. I think that framework is not that useful for the typical developing small open economy, especially over the medium and long run. Okay. Secondly, as someone like even Kletsky pointed out in the 70s, Kletsky, who is associated with the development of Keynesian models along with Keynes, he actually recognized that developing economies tend to suffer from shortages of capacity rather than demand side problems. That doesn't mean that demand side problems are not important. They are extremely important, but when we are thinking about longer run issues, for the typical developing economy, the main issue is capacity bottlenecks, capacity constraints. And in other words, one way to look at that is that the main issue is shortage of capital. Capital is the scarce factor of production. Labor has much lower productivity in the traditional sector. And that makes it important to move labor from the less productive sectors to the more productive modern sectors. And that also generates some insider-outsider distinctions in the labor market that are important from an economic and a political economic point of view. At least in the initial stages of production, typically most productivity improvements come from moving capital from low to high productivity sectors. That's the main channel, I think, of productivity improvements in initial stages of development. As economies develop, other processes such as imitation, reverse engineering, and learning by doing, learning by exporting, learning by watching, learning by investing become more and more important as the economy moves towards the technological frontier. And in this sense, developing economies have a latecomer advantage. Generally, it's easier to imitate than to innovate, because you don't need the infrastructure that's required for innovation. But that doesn't mean that imitation or reverse engineering is easy. That's one of the hardest challenges in the process of development. But the point is that the fact that imitation is the key mechanism here gives latecomers an advantage. The capacity of the industrial sector to absorb labor from the traditional sector, that's another big challenge, right? So a famous historical example is the Irish potato famine, where there was a lot of outward immigration from the traditional sector in Ireland in the 1840s and 50s, but there was no capacity within the industrial sector in Ireland to absorb that immigration. And so that immigration went to England and the rest of the world. A counterexample where within the country there was capacity to absorb the immigrating labor, where that capacity existed, is China. Right? China, since the 1980s, there's been massive migration of hundreds of millions of workers from the traditional sector to the modern sector. And the fact that the modern sector was investing at a rapid pace, so the capacity was growing, ensured that the labor that was moving out of the traditional sector got absorbed within the country in the modern sector. Okay, so relative price determination. Again, using a very standard monopolistic competition model, consider an economy that has a large number of firms that are producing differentiated products. And so that the marginal revenue equals marginal cost condition gives us the standard equation where prices are a markup over unit costs. Okay, so suppose that PI is the price of each firm, and delta is the elasticity of demand, and wages times unit labor coefficient gives us the unit labor cost, and labor is the only cost. Within that setup, we could model the elasticity of demand. We could model it as a function of the price of each firm relative to the general price level in the economy, and the price of each firm relative to the prices in the rest of the world, which is EP star. So lambda 1 is the weight given to price differentials within the economy, and lambda 2 is the weight given to the international price differential. And within this framework, without going into too much detail, what we would get is that if all firms are charged the same price and they're monopolistically competitive, then the price level depends on both here. It depends on both domestic costs and it depends on the international prices. Lambda 2, again, is the weight given to international prices. And this is a convex function. So the idea there is that the higher the gap between prices, both domestic and international, the greater the sensitivity of consumers to price changes. Okay, but what I want to emphasize is equations 3 and 4. If lambda 2 is 0, which means that domestic producers give no weight to international competition, right, to the international pricing. And that's because most of the substitutes for domestic tradables are produced at home. Okay. So if lambda 2 is 0, then the price level, the general price level, should only reflect domestic costs. Right? And that makes sense intuitively. If all the substitutes, all the competition is coming from within the economy, then it's domestic costs that matter. If, on the other hand, and now I'm going to focus on equation 3, if most of the substitutes produced, if most of the competition is abroad, then equation 3 becomes applicable. So if lambda 2 is really high, if it approaches infinity, then what we get is that domestic price level reflects the prices of international competitors. Okay, so the domestic economy is a price taker, basically. And I think for most small open economies, right, and one could make a case that it's different for large economies with large internal markets like maybe Brazil, or that it's different for individual sectors like the copper sector for Chile, where there are very few international competitors at the same scale. With those exceptions, for a typical developing economy, I think equation 3 is much more applicable than equation 4. That doesn't mean that domestic competition is not important, but since most of the substitutes are produced abroad, the domestic producers are going to be price takers. So the price of tradables is going to come from abroad. Okay, so that's the first thing I want to highlight, which is going to, that's the first ingredient that's going to go into my model that I wanted to highlight. One illustration of that is this. So this is a classification of goods based on Rauch 1999, his conservative definition. He classified products as homogeneous, differentiated, and the difference was how their pricing is determined. Without going into too much detail, just to give you a big picture idea, if we distinguish between low income, middle income, and high income countries, what you see in this figure is that the continuous dark line, which is this line at the top, that's for high income countries. High income country products, I think I got something. Okay, so this is the median share of differentiated goods in total exports. And if you look at this figure, the high income OECD countries have the highest median share of differentiated goods in total exports. And that's been consistent since way back in the 60s, which is the earliest that we have the data for. And the low income countries have the lowest share of differentiated products in their exports. It's increased a little bit, mainly because of a few countries, but generally the picture is pretty clear. High-income countries produce much more differentiated goods than low-income countries. Okay, I'll skip this. Let's go to the basic framework that I want to discuss. So it's going to have two sectors. There's a non-tradable sector, which is the traditional sector. It produces simple agricultural goods, simple services, maybe even very simple manufactures using labor and land. the tradable good produces using labor and capital. So capital is only used in the tradable sector. That's one thing that distinguishes the tradable good. It's produced in the modern sector, the modern capitalistic sector, and it uses capital. It uses a fixed coefficients technology, so there's no factor substitution. The goods are substitutes in consumption. Okay. The other main feature is that it's a developing economy with deep pockets of underemployment in the traditional rural sector. So that's the Arthur Lewis kind of underemployment, where, for example, you have a family of 15 working on a farm where you only need maybe 11 people. Right? So there's underemployment. Everyone is sharing the labor, but everyone is not fully employed. Okay. To simplify, I'm going to assume that only labor, owners of capital save, capital and land save, workers do not save. It's not a crucial assumption, but that's what I'm making here. And capital goods are imported. So all capital goods are imported. That's a stylized reflection of the fact that most sophisticated capital goods are imported into the typical developing economy. This is the point I was making earlier. The tradable good is priced in international markets. So in that sector, producers are price takers. Whereas in the non-tradable sector, prices are obviously determined domestically in the domestic markets. The modern tradable sector, the production there requires skills, which gives workers some bargaining power. So there are bargained wages in that sector. And for simplicity, I'm going to assume no government spending and no taxation. So the public sector I am leaving out. So this is just a formalization of those statements. There is the non-tradable production, which is equation 5. It uses labor and land, which means diminishing returns to labor. It's not a crucial assumption, but that's what I'm making here. So gamma is less than 1. Equation 6 is just talking about wage determination in the non-tradable sector. And again, N throughout is for non-tradables. The rest of the notation is pretty standard. W is for wages. Gamma is this coefficient here, the diminishing returns coefficient. And V or mu is some social convention. So V gamma is the proportion of the marginal product that labor gets as the effective wage. And that proportion is decided by social convention or whatever you want to, however you want to think about it. The rest goes to landlords. That's equation 7. Okay, so once the wages are paid, the rest goes to the landlords, and that's the rents. The more interesting gauge of income in the non-tradable sector for workers is the shared wage. When there's underemployment, it's hard to define what the wage is going to look like. Okay. So think of the shared wage as the effective wage, which is WN here, multiplied by the total number of laborers, divided by the total amount of population outside the tradable sector. Okay, that gives us the average wage, or what I'm calling the shared wage. And the actual wage is likely to be somewhere between the shared wage and the effective wage. But I want to highlight equation 8, the left-hand side, which is the shared wage. That's what I'm going to use as the fallback position for workers. So workers in the tradable sector have a fallback position. If they lose their job in the tradable sector, they will get the shared wage, which is this left-hand side of equation 8. Okay. The tradable sector, as I said before, is capital constrained. And I want to jump to equation 11, which defines, or actually I shouldn't skip equation 10. Equation 10 is the wage determination in the tradable sector. Okay. So there's some benchmark real wage, which is determined by efficiency wages and bargaining. How much workers actually get at any point in time above that benchmark depends on their negotiating position. And the negotiating position, again, is a function of their fallback position, which is the shared wage in equation 11. So the evolution of phi, which is the premium over WT bar here. Okay. So the evolution of the real wage in the tradable sector is going to be a function of the fallback position. And because labor can move between the two sectors, in the steady state, you would expect some kind of convergence between the two wages. It doesn't have to be perfect convergence, but you would expect some kind of convergence between the premium adjusted real wage in the tradable sector and the fallback position. Okay. The last component, actually not the last, but another important component is the investment function, equation 13. So I'm assuming here that investment is a function of profitability. Okay. And with full capital utilization or fixed capital utilization, that means investment is a function of the profit rate. So there's an independent investment function. That's a Keynesian specification, right? Having an independent investment function. And that investment function, the argument there is the profit rate. And there's some benchmark profit rate, R bar. If R is above that benchmark, investors would invest. Otherwise, they wouldn't invest. Okay. And that profit rate is going to be a negative function of the real wage in the tradable sector. Let me put it this way. It's going to be a negative function of the real output wage or the real product wage in the tradable sector. And the real product wage is obviously the WT bar in terms of non-tradables divided by the real exchange rate. And the real exchange rate here is the relative price of tradables relative to non-tradables. That's the Q here. That's the real exchange rate. Okay, I'm going to skip the trade balance specification. That's not, it just automatically comes out of this. Okay, so I don't want to focus on the algebra or the symbols. That'll take too much time and it's boring anyway. The only thing I want to say about equation 15 is that if we assume any kind of Cobb-Douglas consumption function, so this is not an Euler specification, we don't have forward-looking expectations. We can talk about that later if you have time, but at this point, because of balance sheet constraints, etc., consumption is a function of current income. And current income would involve both worker income, which is the left part of the right-hand side, and it would include rental income, which again is incorporated here. And on the right-hand side, we have the income in the tradable sector. Okay. Similarly for consumption of the tradables. To close the model, the non-tradable sector clears. So the non-tradable good is consumed and consumption equals output. Okay, so again, the only thing I want to emphasize here is the solutions that come out of this, the short-term solution, which is that employment in the non-tradable sector in this setup is going to be demand-led. It's going to be a function of how much demand is coming from the tradable sector, and that's a function of how big the tradable sector is, which is this K here, which is why I've highlighted K. Right? So all these variables are a function of the size of the tradable sector. Especially to highlight here, the fallback position is a function of how big, it's a positive function of how much demand there is coming from the tradable sector. Okay, that's something I want to highlight again, because it's going to generate the dynamics. The fallback position, which is the shared wedge in the non-tradable sector, is a function of demand coming from the tradable sector. It's a positive function of that. Okay. So in this setup, there are no diminishing returns to capital accumulation, unlike the solo, etc. So one might think that there's no constraint on investment, We have an independent investment function, and it's a function of profitability. There seem to be no constraints, but yet there are constraints, and the constraints in the framework that I'm going to discuss today, because of lack of time, this is what I'm going to focus on. In this, the constraint comes from the fact that there is distributional conflict in the economy because of the insider-outsider distinction between the modern sector and the traditional sector.
Sorry, Professor Rasmi, you have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so let's, let me back up a little. Equation 21 is the equation that determines the fallback position. Okay. That helps generate a dynamic system with two equations. One is equation 11, which is the distributional equation, right? The real wage in the tradable sector. And the second is the capital accumulation equation, how capital accumulates. That's the independent investment function given by 13. Okay, if I plot that system graphically, I put the premium in the tradable sector on the y-axis and the capital stock on the x-axis. Okay. The investment equation, the rate of growth of capital stock, is independent of K. So the K dot equals 0 isoocline is horizontal. Okay. The distributional isoocline is upward sloping. Why? Because if the capital stock increases, okay, the fallback position for tradable sector workers improves, right? Because now the shared wage in the non-tradable sector is higher. That means that the premium in the tradable sector rises. Okay. That's why we have the upward sloping phi dot isoocline. Okay, so just a quick thought experiment. Suppose there's a real exchange rate change. Suppose there's a devaluation, a real undervaluation. What happens? Okay, so policymakers are thinking, if we have a real undervaluation, we can improve things on the trade balance front, or maybe we can, it can act as a subsidy for investment. Okay, does that succeed? Well, that depends. So the immediate impact of a rise in the real exchange rate is to increase profitability in the tradable sector, and investment picks up. Okay, so we start moving in a rightward direction. At the same time, since there's going to be in the short run a shift in demand towards non-tradables because they are now cheaper because of the depreciation, that's going to improve the fallback position of workers in the traditional sector. Okay. So the wage premium now starts rising in the tradable sector, both because the real undervaluation has reduced tradable wages, but also because the fallback position is now actually improved. So for both those reasons, now fee is increasing. Okay. And we could talk about the dynamics, but just to make it short, whether the policy succeeds in raising the level of capital stock depends. Even though there are no diminishing returns to capital and we have no factor substitution, it depends on how strongly the real wage in the tradable sector reacts, how fast it picks up. If there's very strong substitution, for example, towards non-tradables, that generates very fast wage increases, which undermines the initial policy move, and we end up at a lower level of capital stock. The wage premium has increased, but the capital stock is lower. If, on the other hand, that effect is weak, if the shift in demand towards non-tradables is relatively weak, we could have a situation where there's enough time for investment to raise the capital stock in the steady state, even though wages are higher. Okay. So that's even in the simple setup with no diminishing returns, distributional complications make policy tricky. And so the political economy aspect really matters. We could consider other things. So this was an example where wage inflation, rapid wage inflation, undermines the original or possibly undermines the original intent of policy. We could think of other things. We could think of terms of trade shocks. So we could think of an economy which is rich in natural resources. We could think of natural resources as a bounty. And in a simple setup, we could think of them as something that's descended from the heavens, and the country can just export it without consuming it. Okay. And then we can talk about Dutch disease factors in that case. So we could talk about what happens if there's terms of trade shock or a new discovery of natural resources. In that case, what would happen is that we would get the Dutch disease. The traditional tradable sector would shrink. The non-tradable sector would expand. Obviously, the country is exporting more primary commodities, but the modern manufacturing tradable sector shrinks. We could also think of other things such as trade balance constraints. We could think of supply side bottlenecks, which I haven't talked about here. You could have an economy where you have, for example, an agricultural economy where there is a couple of bad harvests. So there are now supply side constraints, and that affects relative prices. In the paper, I discussed that, but here I'll skip that. And since I have 4 more minutes, I'll just talk about a couple of big picture issues. So the Dutch disease issue, one way to think about it is the classic Dornbusch-Fisher-Samuelson 1977 paper, where you have a range of sectors, a spectrum, and you can arrange the economy so that the sectors, so that the economy is ordered in terms of comparative advantage. Okay. The largest comparative advantage sectors are to the left and the lowest to the right. And if you have a primary commodity terms of trade shock, what that will mean is that the sectors that the country has the largest comparative advantage in are the most likely to survive. Okay, which in a lot of developing economies would mean the primary commodity sector. We could also, actually 3 minutes, let me conclude, and maybe later on, if there are questions, we can discuss more. I've tried to, with the help of a simple framework, to discuss how the dual nature of labor markets, the existence of traditional sector along with a modern one, and the presence of trade balance constraints and distributional conflict, how those things mean that even without diminishing returns to capital, policy is tricky, and development is a tricky process. I've tried to make this framework as parsimonious as possible, but there are lots of things that people have already done that could be incorporated and that are important, like economies of scale, external and internal, dynamically evolving comparative advantage, market imperfections, diversification, imitation, innovation, learning by exporting, other important aspects that are really important and that have been associated with the tradable sector in recent literature. Obviously, monetary considerations are really important, and I'm speaking to representatives from the central bank. You know this better than me. In a primary commodity economy, one would also want to distinguish between temporary and permanent shocks, anticipated and unanticipated shocks. One has to think about the role of history versus forward-looking expectations in a multiple equilibrium world. And as always, some of these mechanisms are more or less important over different horizons of time and in different parts of the world and for different kinds of economies. But the major underlying theme that I want to emphasize is that even if we simplify, even if we abstract away from intertemporal considerations and from diminishing returns and factor substitution, even in that world, the fact that developing economies have dual labor markets and there are huge differences between the traditional sector and the modern sector generates a lot of interesting thought experiments and is something that's that I hope there's a lot of work on in the coming years. Thank you. I think I finished right on time, so that's good.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Razmi, for this very interesting presentation. We'll have now the comments by Emiliano Liebman. Emiliano, you have 10 minutes.
Great, thank you. I will make up for Arslan 4 minutes, so no worries. Well, hi everybody. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to comment Arslan paper. Thanks Arslan for the paper and sorry for not sending the comments in advance. Also, I would like to thank the VCRA for organizing the seminar and the invitation. A disclaimer, we have been discussing those issues with Arslan for almost 10 years and it's hard to find new things to say, but I promise I will do my best. So I think Arslan have taken important steps towards integrating additional supply side considerations into models that consider that the tradable sector development matters for growth. The paper does a great job in describing different scenarios and capturing important features of some well-known cases such as the effects from a devaluation, deduction cease, sudden stops, and so on. So I really like the paper on those grounds. Arslan has been working on this for several years. But I would like to make a couple of comments regarding the modeling approach. Those are things that I have been thinking for a while now. So let me start by saying that the paper claims that there could be some deviations from the law of one price in the long run. I was wondering if the opposite is the true. For example, if you consider China. So as China grows and accumulates capital, it may no longer behave as a price taker in world markets, and this may be happening already. So I think the specification makes sense to me, but I was wondering if this is not an issue or something to think about that, whether it's appropriate to consider a fast-growing economy as a price taker in world markets. The second thing, the real exchange rate is assumed to be a policy tool. We know that this could be problematic in some countries, especially in Latin America. I know Arslan have analyzed this issue in other papers, but I think this point needs to be stressed over and over again. I also think that the standard tradable and non-tradable model is complete in many ways. It misses some input-output interactions. For instance, it has tradables produced by labor and other inputs, but what happens if we have tradables produced by non-tradables and non-tradables produced by tradables? Those interactions may affect relative profitability. That's something that I'm not really sure how we should proceed about that. I'm just bringing the question to the floor. I also think it may work to explore a three-good framework. I think I would personally feel more comfortable with non-tradable, exportables, and importables, but again, this comes at the cost of increasing complexity, and I'm not sure if the trade-off is favorable or not, but I think it's something to think about that. I know Arslan have other papers with the real framework, but I would also like to make that point. Finally, I think this is the most important point from a policy perspective. I think there is a scope for more work that analyzes both from a theoretical and an empirical perspective. What are the factors that can influence the short-run and long-run supply elasticities of the modern sector or the tradable sector? For example, we may think that credit constraints or other considerations that affect financial markets may increase or decrease the elasticity of modern sector supply with respect to some of the policy variables. For instance, the paper considers the real exchange rate, but we can think of some other policy interventions. That is also something that I think it's worth to consider. I think it is important to discuss relative prices and the real exchange rate, but maybe we can think about other things that can affect the pace of capital accumulation in the modern sector. I'm not claiming that Arslan paper misses those points, but I think it's something that we need to explore in more detail. I think I spent 5 minutes, but those are my reactions to the paper. Once again, thanks for the BCRA and thanks Arslan for the paper.
Thank you very much, Emiliano. Would you like Professor Razmi to react to the comments before we collect some short questions?
No, I think those are all valid comments. So deviations from the law of one price, so is China still a price taker? I would say yes. So China has been upgrading into more differentiated markets. That is true. But even when they do, so think of cars, for example. China has been trying to enter the car markets now, but they don't enter it as a brand name because Chinese firms don't have brand names yet. So even in those markets, I would argue that China is still largely a price taker. There may be exceptions, of course. So if, for example, China produces, I don't know what the latest number is, but if they produce 60% of the global shoe market, then obviously Chinese producers have some market power. But generally, I would still consider China as a price maker. But the larger point about non-tradable inputs into tradable production, that's an important point. The three good framework, supply elasticities, the real exchange rate as a policy tool. It's obviously the real exchange rate is not perfectly manageable. In fact, especially in liberalized financial markets, it's almost impossible in a fully liberalized financial market to manage the exchange rate, as we know from Latin American experience. So those are all fair points. I would just say that all of those need work. Yeah. Thanks for the comments, Emiliano.
Well, we have some few minutes for a couple of questions. Please try to be short. Javier Garcia Chico.
Hi, thank you for the presentation, Professor Razmi. I have two questions. One is that there is a lot of evidence collected in several papers in recent years about what is called the dominant currency paradigm. That is that international prices are set in dollars. And if I understood the algebra correctly, I didn't follow all the steps, but it seems that implicitly you are assuming that the demand that these producers face is elastic to the price in domestic currency, not in foreign currency. So I wanted to hear whether you think to what extent that the assumption of dominant currency pricing can change or result in that dimension. And then the other is kind of more far-fetched and is related to the issue of considering the real exchange rate as exogenous in a way for the experiments. That is related to the role that maybe fiscal policy may have in influencing the real exchange rate, not just as a monetary policy variable. So those are my points.
Okay, I think if we don't have additional questions, then please, Professor Razmi.
Okay, thanks. So again, those are relevant questions. So the dominant currency paradigm, this is actually consistent with that. So the assumption, so if you can think of international prices as the exchange rate times the price in international currency, and the international price is given in dollars, then that's exogenous, right? So whatever happens to the nominal exchange rate converts that currency, that international price in dollars, to the domestic currency price, right? So the assumption that domestic producers are price takers responding to the international dollar prices, it's perfectly consistent with the DCP, the dominant currency paradigm, I think. The second, just to give everyone a background, maybe probably everyone is familiar with this already, but Gopinath and others have done a lot of work on this, and this is a pretty consistent finding that in their work at least, that a lot of goods, maybe most goods in international markets are priced in dollars, which obviously for every country other than the US, almost every country other than the US, is a foreign currency, right? So exports are priced in a currency that's not the country's domestic currency for most countries and for most goods. So this is consistent with that. And then the second question was about the real exchange rate being affected not just by monetary policy, but also by fiscal policy. And that's a very interesting point, because a lot of times what happens is that countries have their monetary policy or their exchange rate policy pointing in one direction and the fiscal policy pointing in the other direction. So if you want to have consistency, then, for example, a devaluation would have to be supported by fiscal contraction, because most government spending usually goes to non-tradables, right? So you want to also then move the fiscal policy in a direction that's consistent with the direction of your real exchange rate policy, if you have certain goals for the real exchange rate policy. And that's a lot of times that's not the case. But yes, it's not just the central bank. There has to be, the fiscal policy has to be consistent with what the monetary policy authorities are trying to do if there's going to be a successful real exchange rate management policy. Yeah, I agree with that completely.
Okay, thank you very much again, Professor Razmi. We will finish with this presentation and go to the second and last presentation of today's session. The speaker is Mariana Garcia Schmidt. She is currently working as a senior economist at the Economic Modeling Department of the Central Bank of Chile. She also holds a PhD from the University of Columbia. Her fields of interest include macroeconomics, monetary economics, and expectation formation in macroeconomics. And her work has been published in several international peer-reviewed journals. The paper is entitled Evolution and Use of Structural Models at the Central Bank of Chile. So Mariana, the floor is yours.
So thanks everybody for inviting us as the Central Bank of Chile to present this work. The typical disclaimer, of course, applies. The views expressed are those of the presenter, not necessarily those of the central bank. I'm gonna be talking about something really different to what we just saw. We just saw a very theoretically oriented paper, and I'm gonna be telling you about what we do at the central bank. So this is completely, I guess, more policy oriented and more what we actually what we use and why we use it, and in order for us, to see whether that's a good idea or bad, or which we should change or anything, and also share comments and everything. So let's see. So the Central Bank of Chile uses a variety of models to follow and review the state of the economy. Why are the models important in general? I think we all know that they really help us understand the mechanism today, such as monetary policy transmission mechanism, and also produce forecasts for inflation and important macro variables. One of the main focus of the central bank is to do that. In order to do monetary policy, we need to understand what's going on in the economy and how the economy works, and and for that, models are really helpful. the range of models that any central bank has, I guess, and the Central Bank of Chile in particular, range from very simple models like an AR equation or VARs to very large, fully fledged dynamic and stochastic general equilibrium models. I'm going to be focusing on that today, which is like the more structural part, in order to go in deep to what we have in our models and the directions we're thinking about going, and maybe with that, what is still missing. And I think that's a really important question about this, what I'm going to be presenting today. So just to review and to see where this presentation came from. So a part of the increased transparency communication strategy, the CBC updated the public documentation of its policy framework. This was a book that was released in 2019 that's called Chile's Monetary Policy Within an Inflation Targeting Framework. And with that, it accompanied a book that's called Uso de Modelos Macroeconómicos en el Banco Central de Chile, which is a book that explains all the types of models used, from the, again, really simple to the very complicated ones. This presentation and the accompanying paper is based on that book. I'm grabbing a little bit of everything in order for you to see what we do and why we do it. This was put, so as Germán said, I work at the modeling department of the Central Bank. This is a specialized department that they have to, so we have to develop new models. We need new models, and we have to maintain them, at the frontier of knowledge, or expand them if we need to. So, and this is a special issue because it's apart from all the policy matters. So we focus on developing models and updating them. And we have to, of course, we have to talk a lot and be completely connected with the policy area, because the reason we develop models is for that, but we specialize on that. So I just want to make that clear. So what I'm going to be talking about today particularly is first the primary DSGE model that the central bank uses. It's called the XMAS, and I'm going to be explaining you what the main parts are, and how it was developed and why it has been changed sometimes. This is a very large model with many nominal variabilities, large variety of goods and shocks. Its main agents, as any, I guess, the most large DSGE models are household firms, fiscal monetary authorities, and an external sector. It has a labor market with search and matching frictions. So those are the principal characteristics. And there, the central bank also has other models, which are also structural, that we call satellite models. And those are developed and are currently used and sometimes many times in a year for questions that the XMAS is not designed to answer, or we just need, an additional mechanism or more detail in answering. I'm going to be talking about one example of that model. Actually, one example that we developed with Javier Garcia Chico, that when he was at the Central Bank of Chile. But there are others, so this is just an example. Actually, the accompanying paper has an OLG model that was also recently developed and is currently being used, very importantly in Chile. So when there's, in general, our department, when there's a new question that comes from the board or economics in general, and we need to answer that. First, of course, we see whether the XMAS can tackle it, and if it doesn't, then we have to study, what are the necessary features that the model needs to include, and then we see whether it's possible, convenient, and necessary for the XMAS to include it, or is it better to develop a satellite? And I think one of the things that I want to transmit is that we have models, so not everything has to be answered by the same model. We have a main model that is the one that we use all the time, which is the XMAS, and the focus there is on forecasts, and to help monetary policy. But there are many other questions that we need to answer, and we also need models. And if we put everything in one model, everything, it will be unmanageable. So I think that is the point. And that separation is not all the time so clear. So you have to see whether it's convenient enough to have it in XMAS, or if it's necessary enough. And if it's not, then you just develop the satellite model. Sometimes a satellite model is going to be used once, and other times it's going to be used like many times. So the agenda I'm going to go through today is to explain you a little bit of the XMAS with its main assumptions and mechanism. Then I'm going to be talking about a change, an important change that we did to the XMAS, which was introducing migration, and explain why we did it and why it was done in the XMAS and not in a satellite. And then I'm going to be talking about, as an example of a satellite model, which is the TNT model, tradable, non-tradable model. That's the one we developed with Javier. And finally, I'm going to be concluding. So the XMAS stands for the Extended Model for Policy Analysis and Simulations. It was an extension of the model that the central bank used to have, which is a model that was developed in 2007. So we have all that documentation, of course, in the webpage, but so that model was used many times and was continuously updated since 2007. But then in 2016, a formal upgrade started with, the economists at Central Bank of Chile that ended up in a paper in 2019. It shares similar structure with models from other inflation targeting central banks, like communication, capital and labor, like many actors, many goods, many shocks. Very important key feature of small open economies, like price taker. And it also, of course, has some specific issues, specific features of the Chilean economy. The most important ones are that we have an important mining sector that's modeled separately, like it has investment, and a structural role for the fiscal expenditures and other expenses. The main limitations that we think of and that are very important, and for this reason we sometimes need satellite models in order to explore them a little bit further. It includes very limited financial frictions. It only has a limited bond structure. That the external interest rate depends on the amount of debt, that kind of stuff, but it doesn't have a formal banking sector or anything that has like all these informational issues and stuff that in real economy they're very important sometimes. We have rational expectations, and there's a limited heterogeneity of agents. There's only 2 types of agents instead of hack models, which is like thinking about much more heterogeneity in detail. I'm only going to be talking about intuition and all that. I'm going to be telling you about what the model has, but all the specific details you can go to the paper, which is a working paper of the central bank, and with the book that we launched this last year, we have replication codes as well, so you can even go there and download and run the model in the online repository of the book. So in general, the XMAS, as I told you, has like 4 agents, which is like households, firms, external sector, and fiscal and monetary authority. There are a lot of interconnections between the firms. I don't want you to focus on each one of them. Just that there's a lot of connections between households and firms. On the one hand, households provide labor and capital, and the firms produce using them, of course, and they provide the goods that they consume. There's also a lot of issues with external sectors, but always in a small open economy assumption. We are price takers. So all of that is actually like exogenous, and we take them as given. And the fiscal and monetary authority, I think maybe the monetary policy is quite simple. We're gonna say that it's a Taylor rule, but the fiscal authority has all the assumptions, that the structural assumptions that are really used and are really important for Chile as an economy. So the households, their members can be employed or unemployed. We have, and there's full risk sharing within each household, so they consume the same at the end. They derive utility from consuming public and private goods, and the private goods with habits, and leisure, which is defined as not worked hours. There are 2 types of households, and this is like the limited heterogeneity. One are restricted, which are non-recurrents, and the other ones are unrestricted, which they choose saving, etc. The restricted, they just consume the income net of transfers. And what is the income? They have wages from the employed members and unemployment benefits from the unemployed, and they can get lump sum transfer from the government. The expenditure on the other side is consumption and taxes on labor, income, or consumption lump sum that they need to pay. In addition to that, to those income and expenditure, the unrestricted recurrent houses, they have ways to invest and save to smooth consumption. So they can buy domestic currency, government and foreign currency bonds. They can buy investment goods that determines their physical capital. They rent their capital then to the firms. They get dividends from domestic firms and rent from foreign firms, and they pay taxes on dividends and capital income. So the most important thing is that they can, save and decide to smooth consumption if they want. The firms are in a circular system. We're going to go a little bit, not in every detail, but to see the whole picture. So we're going to start with these capital goods and go around the circle. So first, the capital goods are produced from these final goods that we're going to talk about at the end. But so the mining capital is produced from specific investment good, non-mining capital from other specific investment good, and there's public capital. So there's three production of capital goods. This is done by competitive firms. Then we have these homogeneous goods that is produced. So first we have, so the mining sector is going to produce an exportable mining good with the mining capital and a fixed input. And then there's going to be a production of an homogeneous local good, which is done by non-mining capital, which is private, and then public capital. This is mixed with labor and oil. It's going to produce this homogeneous local good. This is done by competitive firms as well, and it includes productivity shocks in order to differentiate productivity issues in each sector. Then, what the exportable mining good is going to be exported, but the homogeneous local good is going to be the input to produce differentiated goods. It's going to produce the differentiated local good and also a differentiated exportable good. So this economy exports two goods, the mining and the differentiated exportable, then that becomes a composite. Another differentiated good that is produced is the differentiated foreign good that is produced with imports. They produce one-to-one, so one good produces one differentiated good, and here is where we put the nominal rigidities. So it's they do this. The firms do it with monopolistic competition on couple prices. They don't choose the optimal price every time. When they don't choose the optimal price, then they have indexation with a mixture of the CPI price index and also the target. So this is where all the nominal stuff appears. And then these differentiated goods are used to produce composite. This is again the differentiated local is going to be produced. So it's going to be producing a local composite. The differentiated foreign is going to be producing a foreign composite, and then the differentiated exportable, which is going to be producing exportable composite that is exported. All of this is done with perfect competition. And finally, we have that it goes around the circle to produce the local composite good, and the foreign composite good goes around to produce the final goods, which is the first part, or the investment final goods, and then the consumption goods. So the consumption goods are the regular consumption, an agricultural consumption good, and a government consumption good. And the first two of these, the regular consumption and agricultural consumption, then if you sum this with oil, you have the final consumption good, which is the one that's consumed by the household. So it is quite, there's a lot going on in the firms, but you can see it's like by layers. Then we have a fiscal authority that has the government consumption, the public investment, and transfer to household determined by the structural balance rule. That's it's implemented in Chile for a while. It determines not to spend all of the money that the government gets every period. It spends more when there's worse conditions and less when there's more. The fiscal authority also collects taxes on firms and can issue debt, and it also has a mechanism to reduce the volatility of the domestic price of oil, which is consistent with this MEPCO, which is el mecanismo de estabilización del precio del combustible, which is a way not to have, all the variation in the price of oil. Then the monetary authority follows a Taylor rule, which is a function of past interest rate, an inflation measure that depends on current and also expected inflation, an output that also there's that depends on the deviation from growth. And then the shocks that are introduced in the monetary authority are they don't have they are non-zero correlation shocks. That means they are and that is so that was an issue. Actually, that was one of the things that was changed not so much long ago, and that was because it has a much better fit in the model we discovered afterward. And then the external agents, they sell oil and non-oil imports. They buy the exportable composite and mining goods. They supply foreign goods, and they receive rents from partial ownership of the mining sector. The external prices. So the external sector gives external prices as a small open economy assumption. And these prices are set exogenously and are a function of two things, a common global factor and specific price shocks. And these prices include the price of oil, the mining good, the importable, and the price index. So sometimes there's a movement in the prices of these goods are all at the same time in different scales, of course. And sometimes they move differently, but we discovered that actually, like many times, the movements were common to all external prices and not only one of them. For us, it's really important the price of copper, so we follow them really closely, and it's really important whether the price of copper is moving alone, by conditions in the copper market, or whether it moves, by like a general movement of international prices. The nominal depreciation is determined by a covering interest parity condition because of the Ricardian household, has this can invest in internal bonds or external bonds. Then the labor market is modeled with certain matching friction and allows for exogenous and endogenous separations. There's a labor union that negotiates a unique labor contract. So this is like a nice simplification that all workers get the same wage and work the same number of hours and have the same probability of being employed. So in total, there are 23 shocks that that drive the dynamics. There are 14 local. Among these are preferences, productivity, monetary policy, and 9 external, which are like many external prices, interest rate, demand of exportable, etc. This model is estimated. So the parameters are set by a combination of calibration and estimation. The calibration in general is averages of historical things and everything, and the estimation uses 24 series between 2001 and 2017, which is a period that the inflation targeting was completely implemented, and it's a relatively stable period of policies, I guess, at least in Chile. And this that's in general the overview. So this is the model that we use like all the time. Every time there's forecast and every time we need to answer things, this is the one that is used by the staff. The most important uses are the medium-term forecast, which is main input for central bank forecast scenario and used from policy analysis, and the IPOM, which is our monetary policy report. It is not the only model used. Again, it's always used with we have a semi-structural model with the MCEP. That I'm not gonna go through that model here. But the most important thing of this use is that so we get from actual data, short-term forecasts for domestic variables, and also not so short-term, sometimes even medium-term for external variables. We do the forecast for all the variables in the model, particularly inflation, particularly the interest rate, and with that we build the scenarios. And do the forecast of monetary policy. It's also something that's relatively is many times done is the analysis of shocks that cause historical paths and forecasts. So we not only do the forecast, but also analyze which shock is the main important, the driver of what is happening and what is going to be happening. And if it's really important for us to have a story behind, like if what the model is saying actually is what we think is gonna happen or not, and it's really important to make those two talk. And then the other important use is contrafactual analysis, which is used for risk and sensitivity assessment. It's part of the policy discussion and also of the monetary policy reports, and show the quantitative implication of the realization of shocks that may occur, and particularly, for Chile, for a time now and since COVID, it's really important to assume what is going to happen. So probably you have heard that we have the vaccination process here is going really well, but of course there are scenarios whether it's going to go slower or faster, and what's going to that imply for the economy. And so we need a model to document and quantify what are the implications of different scenarios for the forecast, and whether we're going to get to the target, monetary target. So given that, so that's the XMAS. One of the things that we didn't include actually from in this first version, not the mass, not even the first version of the XMAS, was immigration.
Excuse me, Mariana, you have 10 minutes left.
Perfect. So Chile was not a country that used to receive many immigrants. You can see here in the graph below. So the mass, the first model, was developed in 2007. So the percentage of foreigners, or as a part of the population, was like less than 1%. And then even when the XMAS was starting to be developed, we had data until 2015, or estimation of data until 2015, and even then the percentage is like 3%. And as part of the labor force, these numbers are even like lower, and then they become bigger. But starting in 2016, you see that there's a huge increase for us of immigration, and this is something that was not included in our models. We didn't know the answer to what does this cause, how is this going to affect inflation, or how is this going to affect our mechanisms. But we are not, so we did not, and we are still not expected to revert this anytime soon. So we need to be able to answer these kind of questions, and our main model didn't answer that. So what we did, what the two of the economists of our department did, which is Garcia, which is my co-author, and Guerra Salas, which is somebody that just moved to another department but was part of ours, was to include immigration in the XMAS. So the priori effect of immigration shock is ambiguous. On the one hand, it has a demand channel because there's a larger population, which increases demand and inflation, But on the other hand, it has a labor supply channel because there's more people in the labor market. It makes it slacker, it contains the wage growth and generates disinflationary pressures. So the way we did this, or these economists did this, was to create an exogenous variation in the size of the labor force. So they also introduced a share of the immigrants in the labor force as an observable in order to be able to talk about this. And then the immigration shock is an exogenous and quasi-permanent increase in the labor force. Of course, at the end, in the infinity, everything goes back to a steady state. But this is like really, really persistent. And immigrants, it's assumed that arrive as unemployed and must search for jobs. So there are many assumptions that change the directions and the consequences of having this. The three most important ones that these authors thought of was, for example, if they experience an underemployment spell or not. Was it the same? Is it the same for an immigrant that just arrived as a Chilean person to get a job? Do they have the same probability or not? Then, do they send remittances? Is that money that they earn, is it stay here or does it go away? Or are they willing to work for a lower wage? If you leave your country and you move to another country, is that like what is the reason that? And then you have to go through all the study the types of immigrants that you have. But the thing is that you have different assumptions that that generate different conclusions. So including migration under the baseline, which is that they do not experience underemployment spell, they do not send remittances, and they're not willing to work for lower wage, we get that the immigration shock makes the demand channel dominate, and it's inflationary. So everything else equals, this shock causes higher inflation and output. But if you do another, which is like with a strong labor supply effect, which is that the immigrants are willing for work in the short terms for lower wages, then you get actually that at least in the short run, the effect is it decreases inflation, you know, and it increases more than nominal GDP, but it generates a disinflationary pressure. Well, anyways, this change, which is immigration, because it is something that affects the whole economy, because it's something that is not expected to revert, it was really important to be included in the XMAS. And so that's what it was done. And then this is the last part, I'm gonna be talking about one of the satellite models. So one, as any other, I guess, small open economy with a flexible exchange rate, sometimes we experience very important movement of the nominal exchange rate, and that impacts not only inflation, but also, you know, real variables. And we need to understand why did the movement happen? How is it gonna affect us? Do we need to respond as, you know, the monetary policy needs to respond or not? So that's what we did. And this is described in Garcia-Chico and Garcia-Schmidt 2020, which is a working paper of the Central Bank. And it's a model, it's a fully fledged DSGE model. And the main difference with XMAS is that it has a non-tradable sector and a more general imported input. So here, you know, there's an imported input that's not only oil, that you use differently in the different sectors, and particularly differently in the tradable and the non-tradable sector. And like, because we included more stuff in the one hand, we had to have a simplified version of the government problem, the labor market structure, and other non-essential features. It is used many times. It has been used, and it will continue to be used when there's, particularly when there's large movement in the nominal exchange rate. The typical questions to answer are: which is the shock that originated the movement? How long will that shock affect, you know, the economy and the different sectors? And how should monetary policy respond? And that's, I guess, the final issue for us, right? So we need to know, is this movement in the nominal exchange rate is going to be affect, and it's going to make our inflation go up beyond the target for how long? Do we need to respond or not? Are we not going to have time to respond? So the first main insight of this model is that the effects, and I guess it's expectable, that the effects of the tradable sector are more immediate and short-lived than in the non-tradable sector. They are delayed and last longer. This is because the non-tradable sector is not directly affected in the sense that, you know, the market conditions are only determined inside the economy. It's not in competition with the external sectors. But it features higher price rigidity and indexation. So any change that happens even in the tradable prices is going to go through the CPI, and it's going to impact then the non-tradable prices via this higher indexation. And the second main insight, which is what I guess we most talk about in the paper, is that not all nominal exchange rate movements have the same inflationary consequences, and this has very different policy implications. Here we see the exchange rate pass-through to different shocks. So here we have international prices on the one hand, rise risk premium or international interest rate. These two affect the uncovered interest rate parity condition. And we see that when there is a shock to international prices, which is a shock that happens, like the most important shock that affects the nominal exchange rate, the effect is really low in local prices, and you cannot really see it, but it happens immediately. So it happens within the first 2 quarters. In contrast, if there's a shock to the risk premium or in the international interest rate, the effect is going to take longer to experience, to affect the local prices, and it's much higher. So the exchange rate pass-through is much higher. So what does that mean at the end? It means that it's really important for us to discover which is the shock that is affecting the nominal exchange rate in order for, you know, the board to decide whether to affect or not affect, or think about it in an inflationary phenomenon. And then just to conclude, so I guess, as we all know, and it's very important, that modeling is an evolving science. The best modeling practices change all the time. Particularly, they change, and they're really important, in the academia. But we central bankers, we need to, because we need to provide the best possible intuition of forecast, we need to be, all the time developing new models and including new features and identifying which is the most important things that we need to talk about in different points in time. So the Cbc modeling strategy, as I just explained, is to have a main model, which is text mass, or the main structural model with the most essential characteristics that need to be included all the time, and satellite models for specific questions or particular mechanisms that need to go in depth, like every now and then, or even regularly, like even once a year or twice a year, but maybe not like every month or every monetary policy meeting. And just for you, to know, there's a current agenda that is evolving. There's a lot of labor things being done as well, but a really important project that we have now is a DSGE with important financial frictions, because we are a small open economy developing an economy that, it's important to have like frictions in the financial system, and a role for macroprudential policies to study what's gonna go next, especially when you are, at the effective lower bound and you need to do other stuff. So that,
Thank you very much, Mariana, for your presentation. We'll have now the comments by George McCandless, who is researcher at the Central Bank of Argentina. George, you have up to 10 minutes.
Okay, let me see if I can put up a screen. Can you see that?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
First, I want to comment on the, excuse me a minute here. There we go. We had three models talked about here. The Xmas, I love the acronyms that we get for some of these models. The Bank of England had one that was known as Beckham for some reason that I don't follow football much, so it may have something to do with that. It's a very well-developed model, very near the technological frontier for central banks developing their DSGE models. It's quite impressive in its use of sectors. By the way, my comments are based upon the paper I got. There was some changes in the talk. It's a new Keynesian type model with Calvo type pricing in order to get some persistence to get the right response to monetary policy. And it's a multi-sector model, which I think is very useful, particularly with the importance of the mineral sector in Chile. It has, as most central banks have, it has a number of satellite models to deal with particular questions, the traded and non-traded goods, and an OLG type model for incorporating immigration. Oops. A useful reference with respect to central bank models is from a paper by Chris Sims in 2002, The Roles of Models and Probabilities in Monetary Policy Process. It's a Brookings paper if anybody wants to look it up. Chris did interviews with four banks that were major users of models at the time: the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Fed, and the Swiss Reichsbank. And what was particularly interesting in this was his discussion of the policy process or the forecasting process that the Bank of England went through. It's a large model with multiple sectors that feed into a main model. But more important than that, there's a cycle had something like 9 steps between the technical staff who are designing and calculating the models and the monetary policy board. And these are actually scheduled steps. So before each quarter, they have a time frame in which they should have this part done, this part done, this part done. And the technical staff needs to explain to the policy board their assumptions about shocks. And then the policy board responds to the assumptions about shocks to see whether those are consistent with what they feel is right, in part because the data that people are using for these models are a bit lagged. So the policy board members may feel that things have happened since the last data arrived and need to be taken into account in the projections. And the projections are forecast. Sims, in his paper, though this has been corrected by some central banks, had found some faults with the way the probability distributions of shocks were taken into account. I do have one suggestion. Again, you may be doing this, but it's not clear in the paper that this is done. One of the problems is, what do you do about non-observed shocks? Things like total factor productivity, expectational shocks and things. And one of the things you can do is using data of the observed state variables, or even the observed jump variables, is you can use the observed data, use your model. I have here x equals p, xt equals p of xt minus 1, where xt are the state variables and lambda t's are the stochastic state variables. And you have estimates of the matrices p and q. You can use this backwards to take your q as given, as data, if you have enough of these equations, and calculate the lambdas that result from the outcome in the economy. And so you can actually reconstruct by doing reverse engineering, basically, what the unobserved shocks were or are going to be. And you can take those to your policy board and let them see if they agree with those. You can also use those things as data to do forecasting with for your future unobserved shocks. You may be doing that. If you're not, I think it's a useful strategy to get some sense about how well you're doing on estimating these unobserved shocks. One of the things I have a problem with most of these new Keynesian type models, I have two problems with these new Keynesian type models for monetary policy. One is the staggered price model tends to have a very weird response to technology shocks, and that's unconvincing to me of them. Though staggered wage models seem to be much cleaner in terms of that. The other thing is that most of these models do not, and you mentioned you don't have a well-developed banking sector, and particularly for smaller open economies. The banking sector is really important because the financial market sector is really fairly small, so that the interest rates that the central bank is setting, or the monetary movements that are done by the central bank or the fiscal authorities, impinge in an important way through the banking sector. And it's that kind of impingement through the banking sector that these models don't seem to be including. And you can construct a working capital banking sector that will generate positive responses from central bank monetary policy. So it seems to me that it's useful for a central bank to think about how it works, and in small economies, since they work through the banking sector, it would be useful, I think, and maybe an important improvement in your projections to have a well-developed banking sector. I know that's difficult, but it's being done in some other places, so that might be the way to do it. One small comment on immigration. I noticed that a large fraction of your immigration recently has come from Venezuela. And at least in Argentina, we observed that a lot of the immigrants coming in from Venezuela seem to have a fairly high capital stock, human capital stock. And so that their entrance in the economy is going to be, well, first off, is usually the case with immigrants. They usually come in and take whatever job they can get first off in order to keep themselves alive in the new country. And then with time, they move to sectors where their education can be better utilized. So again, that's not easy to get into a model, but it's pretty clear that immigrant groups are particularly aggressive in trying to work up, first get salaries and then work their way up to utilizing their human capital. Other than that, I'm quite impressed with the structure and the development of the models in Chile, and it would be a good example for the rest of Latin America to follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George, for your comments. Mariana, would you like to react to them before we collect some questions?
Sure. I also have like my co-author is there, so if he wants to add something, he can be free to add as well. Just first, thanks for the comments. I do know the SIMS paper, and you know all these steps that they go through in the Bank of England. We also go through. And it's really hard, you know, to first to have an initial forecast and then go to talk to the board and then have an additional. And we do, I think one of the things that is missing in this paper is to a little more about that. So I'm gonna make sure that, you know, the new version of the paper has an explicit section about this, you know, more in detail that what we go through, because it is actually really important. It's very important to make sense of everything. So no, it's not always sensible, you know, that, so there are some short-term forecasts that are done by other models, like many times they're smaller models, and we put this as an observable in the XMAS, and the XMAS, as you said, is going to give you, you know, the shocks that happened, you know, and that they explain this data it's seeing, but it's actually, you know, the forecasted data. And sometimes it doesn't make sense, and sometimes it does. So it's an important issue of discussing and, you know, going through a consensus. So I'm going to make sure that, you know, that's in the future version. With the new Keynesian models, you're sure about the banking sector. So it's something that there was actually a previous smaller, of course, DSGE model with like a little bit of financial frictions. It didn't have a financial banking sector. So now the model that is being developed, that is called Muffin, by the way, it has, you know, like a banking sector, and it's taken that into account, and it's more important. I don't know if it's gonna end up in the XMAS. I think it's not really compatible to do that yet. Maybe, you know, in the future, but it is important, and we are developing. And finally, I want to talk about the immigration. So as you saw in the graph that I shared, the immigration phenomenon in Chile is quite new for us. So it's not something that we have completely tackled. There is, though, an evolution that we do include in the, I think, in the OLG, and I can be corrected by my co-author, that, you know, they first get here and they just go to a job, and then they search for a job that is more a better match with their capabilities, and then they get, you know, a better match, and they have like a higher wage in that. I didn't know about capital. I don't think we have thought about that they particularly save, I guess, in they invest. So that's something that we are still documenting about our immigrants and what is that going to imply for us. But there is a lot of studying, particularly in the analysis area, when the more empirical part, you know, in order to understand what they do and if they are different and what does that imply for us. And then as we discover these new things, we're probably going to have to include them in our models in order to see whether that's going to be big importance for all the rest of the shocks and the mechanism that, you know. And I think I'm gonna stay there with the comments if Benjamin wants to say something.
Yeah, I mean, just some extra comments. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So with respect to the to the financial sector, as Mariana told you, yeah, we're developing a macro financial model that's called Muffin that take care of the banking issues. It does not have the such friction between banks and firms that's a really interesting point that could give you like a lagged response to monetary policy that we don't have right now. And regarding the use in the main model, well, the strategy that we tend to use in the bank is to first start developing a smaller, more tractable model. And if the features end up to being useful, you can start evaluating what part or which part to integrate into the main model. So right now we are in the satellite part of the financial model, and then we should evaluate with the more applied forecast guys in the bank that are the ones that actually use the model to see how would you proceed to integrate in the financial fraction if they deem to be useful to the main models. Regarding the immigration part, we do have the same issue in Argentina, that the main migrants were Venezuelan, which have equal to a bit higher education than the average Chilean people. So that's different to the immigration pattern that usually the literature consider that is in Europe there, that is lower education than the main population. And about that, Mariana talked about it, is the unemployment spell. What it means that is like we take it from the job ladders literature, that basically people, even with the same education, go jumping from jobs to find it a better match and a better match and a better match. And sometimes when you have an exogenous destruction of that job, that somehow the framework you were working go bankrupt or something, then you have to go back to the ladder because you were in the best match possible, and then you have to start from below, and first you take whatever job you can, and then you start again. And regarding the Venezuelan immigration, we can think that there were a lot of very good matches going around in Venezuela that were destroyed for some reason, and then they come back to Chile and they have start from the bottom of the ladder, and they will eventually get back to normal. So that's why we mean there's a transitory underemployed spell that translates to a transitory lower productivity that eventually will recover and we get back to the normal Chilean productivity, or a bit higher if you assume that they have higher human capital than the average Chilean. And yeah, I think that covers, I mean, beside all that Mariana said, the comments. So, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Benjamin. We have some minutes for collecting questions. Yes, George.
You have a search model for labor in your models, so that you're clearly managing that technology very well. You might consider in the banking sector to have the banks to have to do searches for lending, and that might help slow up the way that the economy reacts to monetary policy changes.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. I'm gonna write that down. Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody have an additional question? Yes, Javier.
Yes. So, hi, Mariana. Thank you for the nice presentation. I was wondering to what extent what happened last year with COVID and the pandemic and lockdowns, etc., changed a bit either the use of the model or the agenda that you have going forward. If you can give us a sense of that, not the specific details, of course, probably it's too long, but thank you.
So of course it has changed. So No, the use of the models, I think they're still useful. The way, so I think the issue is how you input the shock, right? So one of the important things that we have done since before COVID is how to get a good prediction of what's going on. And that's something that changed, I guess, since you were at the bank, and now we have more short-term data, and you have online data that helps you to forecast better what's going on with the sales and that kind of stuff that you can put in the XMAS. The agenda, one of the principal things about the agenda. So in Chile, there's a lot of things going on. One of the things is also like the pension system is under scrutiny, I guess that's how you can put it. And so one of the things that changed the agenda is that that we had to focus more on pensions reforms. Other things that happen and is happening is the introduction of the banking sector, and to put more emphasis on macroprudential policies. And I think that's one issue that's going like in the whole world. It's not only us, that is more focused on macroprudential stuff and how to do a model that is I don't know, general enough, but also that that you can rely on for real time and real life for policy issues. That is not always so direct with macroprudential stuff, I think. So that's changed a lot, but the rest, like we don't have a COVID, like an exact COVID model. There are a lot going on about the evolution of the disease and that kind of stuff, that they are used. And I think the other department, the one that does the forecast, and they do have like not a structural model though, but a semi-structural one that includes that kind of stuff in order to see how it's going to be evolving in Chile. But that.
And just a bit of comment. So we actually did work with a small, like this SEER model that is like epidemiologic models that is based on the one of Eichenbaum, Rebello, and Trabant. And basically, it's a small model that correlates like the epidemiologic part of the usual like biology models with RBC small models that we can use to track and see how different, for example, vaccination patterns could lead to different profiles for the future. And then the challenge is to use that output that is a really like stylized model and translate it into different shocks or paths for different variables that the main model can utilize. So, for example, you can say, okay, this we can translate that the smaller vaccine path can be like a longer, lower productivity shock that could use in economy. And that's the challenge, like using judgment, translate what one model says to the main model. And the other thing that we're working is like there's a big push lately in the central bank with the use of microdata. So we have this micro base where you have from the tax agency, when we can see actually what every firm sells to each other and all the networks. So that can give us like a really high frequency estimation of what happens. And we can also match this with other database of firms, and we can see which firms are closing, which firms are hiring, which firms are dropping labor, and trying to have a better estimate of what's happening, and then use that to put that into a way that the model can understand, and that could give you like then the general equilibrium effect that we can try to understand. So that's kind of like the challenge when you use satellite model, and then you wanna use the features that the main model doesn't have. You have to find a way to translate the results of these smaller models into something that the main model can understand. And that could be put adjustment into demand shock or supply shock or job destruction shocks or something like that. So that's kind of like the way we can when we try to make different models like talk within each other. So thank you.
We have one last question by Sebastian Katz. Sebastian.
Okay, thanks, Mariana, for your nice presentation. I want to know, you mentioned that you are working on introducing the role of macroprudential policies and financial frictions, but at the same time, I want to know if you have been following the work by the IMF on the integrated policy framework and the possibility of analyzing others intervention, for example, foreign exchange intervention and the possibility of capital controls. And I want to have a sense of your views if you were following that work by the IMF and other different organizations.
So I haven't been so exactly. So we have many people focusing on different models, in our department. Of course, we follow what the IMF is always doing, but I actually don't know. I'm just coming back to work from maternity leave, so I actually don't know exactly whether we have been focusing on foreign exchange intervention capital controls. So maybe Benjamin knows a little more about it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, our macroprudential model basically is based on the policies that the bank is legally allowed to take care of, that they are mainly a capital requirement for the banks within the country. And the bank, I don't know if it's not allowed or doesn't do it, capital control at the country level. And well, since the 90s, the main push of the countries is going to liberalize more than add capital controls. But I think that's mainly a fiscal policy, not the central bank policy. Regarding the exchange rate controls, well, there's a chapter in the monetary policy framework book that Mariana referred recently that talk about that. And basically, the stance of the bank is that the central bank, unless they see like a deviation from the equilibrium exchange rate, they should intervene. So we don't have a policy of systematic attenuation of exchange rate volatility because the framework of the central bank tends to favor like free floating exchange rates. So we're not into that officially on it.
Just to finish that also, because Benjamin is a little, I think, busy. So we did intervene there was an important intervention at the end of 2019, but it was because of volatility issues. So the exchange rate was moving as crazy because we had this awakening of Chile. But and that's when the bank intervened, and it was because it was not possible for firms to be able to set prices because the exchange rate moved like 20% or 10% like in less than a week. But in a more formal, systematic way as a monetary policy tool, we don't use the exchange rate, and we haven't used it for a very long time. So we did have a relatively managed when we started inflation targeting, but it was in the 90s. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we are on time. Thank you very much again to the speakers, the discussants, and the participants. We expect to see you tomorrow in our second day session. Let me just mention that we have a slight adjustment in tomorrow's schedule. We will start with the presentation by Professor José Luis Oreiro, then Professor Freitas, and we will finish with the exposition by Gabriel Michelena. So with that clarification, see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.